now. So thanks everybody for coming along to this is the second of Link's annual advocacy training sessions. For anybody who doesn't know me, I don't know everybody who's here today. I'm the Director of Policy and Engagement at Scottish Environment Link, and I'm just here to sit in the hosting chair today. And we've got three fantastic speakers who are all going to come with slightly different perspectives to this topic. But we're looking at storytelling and environmental communication today. So I'll just run through the panel first, and then I'm going to hand over to the first presentation. We will have time at the end for Q&A, so get your thinking caps on for what you might want to ask any of the panelists. But first up, we're going to have Claire Harris, who is a Scotland lead at the Local Storytelling Exchange. Local Storytelling Exchange are an organisation who find and spotlight stories about the green transition across local, regional and national media. After Claire, we're going to have Dr. Chris Pollard, who's a senior researcher at Climate Outreach. Climate Outreach are an organisation who conduct research and provide advice on effective climate communications. And you might have come across some of the work that Climate Outreach do in previous Link advocacy training as well. And finally, we're going to have Ali Kingston, who's a creative lead at Purpose Disruptors, who are a non-profit organisation who are on a mission to help catalyse the marketing, media and advertising industry's climate transition. So I'm just going to hand over to Claire to kick off. And yeah, over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Anne, and nice to see everybody. I know some of you already, but not all of you, so it's great to be here. Local Storytelling Exchange is a member of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, so we're engaged in parallel with a fair bit of work that Link does, including talking about commons. So typically my computer's decided to creep into action, but I just wanted to talk through with you our approach in terms of what we refer to as storytelling, essentially a range of media, comms approaches, and how that then feeds into policy. What I do as Scotland Lead is not just write stories, but also make contacts, make partnerships, find ways where our small team can provide input into policy making and advocacy settings. So we work in partnership with lots of different organisations all across the UK. While my computer's trying to behave, I'll talk to you a little bit about what we do and I guess what we hope the impact will be in a policy setting, given the kind of current climate that we're in and the current narratives that we're experiencing around action on climate. So Local Storytelling Exchange is an NGO. We have, at the moment, 5 former journalists employed to use their journalistic skills around the UK to seek out stories of positive action in terms of the green transition. And that can be anything from somebody managing a community garden to somebody who's working within offshore wind, to business stories, to people stories, whatever that might be. And the reason we work in that way is we kind of see and saw that there was a gap within the wider media for relatable, local level, accessible, I guess, human first stories around the transition. We've been around since 2020, I think, not that long, and continuing to develop what we do. As you all know, the narrative around climate and climate action continues to be challenging, so our kind of role continues to evolve to meet that. What I wanted to run through today was, I guess, a little view of how that's evolved and how our stories kind of feed into policy. I'll just bring some slides, but bear with me, as I say, it's really tricky. The approach that we have is, as I say, essentially around relatability and behaviour and what people see. So at a very basic level, it's around an example of if you saw your neighbour getting solar panels on their home, you might think, oh, that's not something I've thought about before. Maybe I'll look into that. It's that kind of seeing something next to you on your street beginning to feel like it's something you could get on board with. We work quite closely with the work that climate outreach has done around personas and around types of audiences. So really targeting a kind of rooted patriot audience, a sort of general punter audience, rather than people who are necessarily already. I should be sharing my screen now. Apologies. Does that look like a slideshow to you?
I think it's still loading for me.
Right. What I'll maybe do is I'll just. Oh, there's nothing coming up. I'll just stop sharing because I don't want to bore you with that. I'm sorry. My computer's about 3 minutes behind anything that I want to do today. I'll just try one more time. Sorry, guys.
Do you want me to try and share the PDF version?
Yeah, that would be better, I think. Just the speed at which things are working.
That should be sharing now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so what do we do? People power for policy. So the aim is really getting those real stories through to policymakers via the media. So if you want to click on, as I mentioned, we're all based in places. So I'm the Scotland lead, but we have regional leads across the UK, whether that's in Humber, Yorkshire, West Mids, East Anglia, all in locations that are specifically not London and are specifically where there's a fair amount of activity happening around the green transition. Next slide. And our principles are, as you would be familiar with, really action-based, about common sense, really tangible, really about human stories. And the reason for that is exactly as I just talked through, that relatability and approachability. And I think this applies very well in this setting because it's not just about generating those stories that people will then see in their local press, media, socials, but it's about generating a mandate and generating a sense that on the ground people are okay with this stuff. People get that we need this action, this kind of technology. And it's okay for politicians to push forward with that. So I suppose our grounding aim is to create that kind of broad base of a mandate saying we want this. We can see that it's good for the planet. We can also see it's good for our bills, our nature, whatever that might be. Move on to the next slide, please. We recently had some evaluation work done on our output in Scotland, specifically with a sort of ripple effect lens, where we wanted to choose a couple of series of stories and really analyse what impact they had beyond just kind of column inches and the usual media monitoring. And we found that there were a few interfaces, I guess you could call them that were revealed. The evaluation team looked at two sets of stories. So one was around heat pump take up and one was around community energy. And we spoke to all the people around that story. So the subject went, who we worked with in partnership on those stories and what the impact was. And so there's those interfaces which I think are really important to look at. It go beyond the kind of the initial story that you see, that interface between a technical subject and the human angle, that kind of link between a lived experience feeding into policy and that link between the local and the national. And I think that's where we have a really kind of core place in the middle of that, where we're a bit like a conduit and we try to do more with every single story to create that ripple effect. You can see an example on the next slide as to how that plays out. So this is kind of where we were and where we don't want to be. These are the kind of headlines that you'll all be familiar with that are very, very negative around climate action and green tech and whatever that might be. And the next slide kind of shows where we want to be. And these are all headlines that we've generated over the years in various titles. I think it's really important to note the kind of local aspect, which is obviously the first word of our name, but that's again a founding principle around creating that base of awareness at that hyperlocal level. There's a lot of research out there that shows how readers and people and community members trust local media more than the big titles. That's within the sort of legacy media space. But from a policy and advocacy point of view, what we see as well is really targeting those kind of trusted local titles, the things that folk will talk about on their way to work, that they'll share on their local Facebook page, that will generate a bit of noise, tend to be at that local level. And if we can generate that noise that local political players and decision makers will notice, we're already seeing that play out in lots of ways across Scotland, then that's what we would hope to do, rather than trying to kind of target big national headlines first. It's ground up. Next slide, please. These are some little videos that I will send on afterwards that unfortunately my tech is not allowing me to show you. But what I want to talk about is how those stories can be used in so many different ways. So whether that's in kind of legacy media, your local paper that you might pick up or your school gate might be chatting about, and then through to social as well. So the kind of people that we're centering, this guy is fitting a ground source heat pump in Walberswick, and he talks through what he's doing. He's like, oh, here I am, laying the pipe for a ground source heat pump. And he goes on to talk about the job itself, why he enjoys it, why he reckons it's a job for life, and why he reckons it's good for the environment. It's all unprompted. He basically took the camera and talked about that. And I think that's really key because it allows us to think, how would we use that kind of story in terms of translating into a policy ask? Would we be thinking about job creation, apprenticeship support? Would we be thinking about just transition or looking at how do we support young people into STEM careers? The next one, if you want to flick on, is another video we did recently around wildfire, where we spoke about a part-time firefighter up in Aviemore who is out there training landowners to kind of spot the first signs of wildfire and kind of sensible ways to tackle them based on their knowledge of the local area. That did really well. But again, in terms of how we then feed that into a policy ask, it would be about, how do we support advocacy bodies and partners who are looking at these issues around climate impacts, around where we're at now, around resilience, and thinking about how do we continue to get that climate message through, even when we're talking about getting firefighters out on the ground. This one was very much about ensuring that when we're talking about these things, we don't stop talking about the climate. We don't stop talking about mitigation, even when we're talking about, tackling the impacts on the front line. And then the final one, I'll send all this after. This was a great one I went out to in the Gorbals in Glasgow the other week, which we did in partnership with Virtue, who are a body looking at climate resilience and adaptation. There are new build homes in the Gorbals, which are experiencing incredibly high temperatures. As you'll all be aware, it's getting hotter and hotter. And they talked very eloquently about experiencing that and the work that they wanted to see to tackle that, but also the broader awareness, looking at urban places, city centres, and trying to get that sense of awareness out to people who might live just down the road and not make the link between a changing climate more broadly and the fact that they're totally roasting in their new build flat. Where do we go with that? How do we raise awareness, but also feed that into potential policy action, thinking about house building, thinking about what do we need to do to kind of help move these conditions on for people. So all three of those examples are about finding that person who can embody that and really eloquently talk about those challenges in a way that feels relatable. And I mean, you guys are the advocacy experts, but I firmly believe if a decision maker or policy maker is a person in a community as well, so they will relate to that real person's story just as much as a reader of the Five Times would or a user of TikTok would. So we really try not to kind of add a policy layer, but just really stick to those direct human stories. Finally, that it's worth noting, and again, you'll all know that there are very difficult conversations out there in the space around climate action and where we're at. And the sort of behind the headlines work that we do is very much about finding that space to have those difficult conversations, finding alternative voices that aren't kind of engaged and polarized and difficult debates, and trying to find a middle ground, I guess, really for folk to think about, okay, this is not necessarily 100% positive. How do we find a way forward? That's obviously very, very relevant at the moment. We're seeing a lot around the grid upgrade, a lot of kind of push and pull around about, different trade-offs in that space as we move towards more renewable energy. We've just done a really big kind of citizen panel-led project looking specifically at that issue and finding places, for example, in East Anglia, where a community is really, really aligned against a substation development, but at the same time, with our assistants, are thinking about if it really is going to happen, how do we get something out of that? How do we make sure we're at the centre of that process? And they're actually at the moment looking at how they can use that moment, if it goes ahead, to boost nature in their area, and thinking about, essentially a local place plan that suits for them, that boosts nature that they want, that boosts active travel. So it's about where we can do more than just a standalone story and build that ripple effect out into places where people are making decisions about their future. And how do we create spaces for those conversations to take place in a way that isn't heated and a way that isn't polarized? I'll happily send you a link to that report afterwards. But I think it shows that where we've come from, if you want to move on to the final slide, we began as generating legacy press, human stories in local papers, and we still do that. It's our kind of front line. But we're moving much more towards finding the right people to partnership to make sure that that ripple effect from each story is as kind of broad as possible. These are just a few advocacy partners that we've worked with in recent years, where if they really valued our kind of sense of, right, what's on the ground, who's this guy who's doing this work, how can we fit them into a policy ask? So it's that sense of, as I said at the start, being a conduit, being a sort of a broker in the middle, I guess, and thinking about how would we make those policy asks come to life, and how will we broaden that mandate and that base, which gives policymakers the grounds to say, well, actually, yes, this does make sense, and yes, we need to push on this particular policy or a particular line of legislation. So I hope that makes sense and it shows where we're getting to. But happy to take questions at the end and kind of expand on any of that if needed.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire. I'll just pass straight over to Chris now.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just share my slides here. Okay, can you see that okay? Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Chris Pollard. I'm Senior Researcher at Climate Outreach. And I'm going to build on a bit some of the things that Claire mentioned, actually, around the way that climate outreach approaches sort of public engagement and how that can be used for policy. And I'm going to sort of do some show you some of the details of the research that we've produced over the last few years that hopefully will be really useful in the work that you're doing. It is all available on the Climate Outreach website, and then there's lots of detail in there. I'll just be picking little things out, so definitely go and check that out. And some of our partners at More in Common who have helped develop some of the models that we use as well. There's lots of really interesting information there. And of course, I'm available on the email and for contact afterwards if you've got more specific questions. So Climate Outreach tend to deal with public engagement. So thinking about public rather than directly targeting policymakers. But there's key things that are linked there, and Claire mentioned a couple of them already. First one is that this is helping you as an organisation get your policy ideas or policy plans out to the public to create that social mandate that Claire was talking about. There's the help translating what the public think in terms of our work with public engagement. What do the public think and feel about climate and about the environment, how that relates to policy, and then giving that information to policymakers to say, here is how you understand your constituents or the people that you serve better. Here's better information to do that. And the third one is exactly what Claire said. I totally agree. It's that policymakers are actually people who live in the communities as well. They're real people who have the same kind of, when we do our research on folk in the public, it's very much that role as yourself living in a community as a person. You have roles as you're a consumer, you're a citizen, you're a voter. You also have your job. That job happens to be in policy making. You might play different roles within these, but the kind of ideas and the methods we have for trying to speak to people and engage with people should kind of land on all those different ones. And you can tweak it for a role versus someone who's just a homeowner or someone who lives in a community. But at the end of the day, things that really speak to people on the inside, if you understand that better, you can help get your policy messages across. So everybody's here to hear about storytelling. Don't need to say that stories are a brilliant way to communicate information and to really engage with people. But there are, infinite stories about climate change. How can we find those? And Claire talked about finding really interesting, engaging stories, real life examples, and letting people speak to themselves, and the brilliant work that they do at Local Storytelling Exchange. The work that we do is a bit more about how you might tell your own story, and the tweaks and the ways and that you can do that will better engage with the audience and who you're trying to reach. So really, this work today is about how understanding your audience better, or in a new way to help you better engage people with your own story. And this comes from our work from last year, our big research project, or Britain Talks Climate and Nature. We did a big bit of research last year, but it's ongoing. So we're building into it all the time. The website on climate outreach, the Britain Talks Climate and Nature website, has loads of information. We're always adding to it with new bits of research we're doing from various areas. But the idea about it was that to really understand how people in Britain think and feel about climate change. And from our point of view, the feel bit is the most important. There's lots of trackers and polling about what people think about certain things that happen or certain policies. We're very interested in what they feel and their values that might lead to kind of attitudinal changes, thinking that if we can think about those values, we can reach them better with engagement. We did this through a nationally representative survey of Great Britain, and then lots of focus groups to look in more depth about what people think and feel. And it features this 7 different values-based segments of the British population. So this was done in collaboration with More in Common, who devised those seven segments, and they're funded by the ECF. And I will just really quickly go through these different 7 segments. You might be familiar with them and heard people talk about them before. You might have never heard them before. There's absolutely shed loads of information on the More in Common website and the Climate Outreach website. So I'm just going to touch on each of these and how we understand how we like to look at people's values in order to be able to reach them. Now, the way that you might be segmented in this, you can go on the More in Common website and you do a little quiz. You ask 21 questions. Depending on your answers, you're put into one of these different segments, which should kind of summarize your values or your worldview. There's four bigger ones, which are around 3 bigger ones, around 20%, and 4 smaller ones, which are around 10% each. So the first one, I've got there, it says 9%, so that's in Scotland. And you can see in the title, it says GB 10%. So 10% of GB, 9% in Scotland. The first one, skeptical scrollers. They're not skeptical of climate change. They're just skeptical of a lot of the information they receive. We've described them as they're online a lot, they're engaged, they're up for radical change in terms of the way we run society, but they feel alienated by the way climate decisions are made, mainly because of that skepticism around where information is coming from. The second one, which Claire mentioned, the rooted patriots, 20% of GB, a little lower, 18% in Scotland. They're proud of Britain's past in their community, and they want a climate future they can be proud of. So They are very concerned about climate. They want action, but they're also concerned about what's going on right in their community that isn't necessarily related to climate. The economy could be health, could be education, really community minded and want to see action at that level. The third one, 9% in GB and in Scotland, is the established Liberals. We believe we're moving in the right direction on climate through a mix of technology, innovation and global cooperation. They're the most optimistic of the segments, really feel like if we really push good technology, green technologies, and lots of collaboration internationally at the UN and different and IPCC, things like that, then we'll have a lot of action and really believe it's happening and it's going to happen more in the future. The incrementalist left, this is over 20% at GB, but a bit lower, 17% in Scotland. Believe in communities and leaders working together on climate change to improve the status quo. So again, pro-climate action, like the established Liberals, maybe not thinking as much in terms of globalism and tech, maybe thinking more about local action more, but a bit more positive maybe than about what's happening at the moment than the Rooted Patriots. Dissenting disruptors, a fifth at GB level, but almost a quarter in Scotland, recognise the need to tackle climate change, but believe the system is rigged and leaving them behind. So this group are up for a large radical societal change, but really distrusting of traditional institutions. Don't believe politicians who come and tell them that things are going to get better because they've heard it before and they just don't believe it. And very skeptical of action around climate as well. Though all the segments believe that climate change is a thing and is happening. There's no one who's really skeptical anti-climate at the moment. The traditional Conservatives, 8% in GB level, 7% in Scotland. They believe in respecting the environment, but worry that climate action is overbearing and unfair. So equally skeptical as dissenting disruptors in terms of climate action, but they don't want to tear down everything and start again. They've got a lot more trust in government, in the judiciary, and kind of the institutions that we have. It's just those climate actions that they're more distrusting of. And finally, it's the progressive activists, which are 12% at GB and 16% in Scotland. So they want to make climate action. They want climate action to make a world a better place. So very much justice minded, not just climate justice, but racial justice, economic justice, wealth, and climate justice fits into that. They're called activists, but only less than 5% actually go on protests. And most people, there's a good chance that most people in this call would fall in the progressive activists. So it's really important to kind of know who you are and where you're thinking in order to think about who you're speaking to. And interestingly, in Scotland, the pink and the yellow are over-indexed by 4% each. They're both the groups which are more radical, want to see large radical change. Progressive activists want to see radical change, so dissenting disruptors. They're quite different in what those radical changes might be, but both of them are equally unhappy about it. And I guess Scotland might be a bit more radical thinking than the rest of GB, according to that. So this is the reason why we do a little graphic just to show why we use these values rather than more common demographics you might see. So you can see on the left, this is a question that More in Common asked. This isn't climate outreach data, it's More in Common data, but asking, are you worried about climate change? So somewhat or very across the age ranges. You can't really see any pattern there. But when you look by segment, value segment, you can see that 3 are above the average and 3 much further below. So you're starting to look at how values predict what people's attitudes and then therefore my behaviors or decision making comes after that. And that means if you start to target, okay, let's just talk to these lower ones, you can start to think more and be a little bit more efficient on how you're engaging on your policy. But that said, about how everybody's different, there are things that are universal across the groups. So you don't really have to know exactly which segment you're speaking to in order for you to be able to have good communication. And 4 big ones for us are, stories about tackling climate change and protecting nature together. They go really well, do the things at the same time. We know that everybody pretty much across the board loves hearing about nature rather than necessarily climate. Climate's a bit less so, but nature is more likely to have broad appeal. So put those things together. Having stories about progress which is happening, focusing on actions and why they're being taken, and Claire talked about that as well, actually giving concrete examples of the action that's being taken now, not we're going to do this in the future or we need to do this, but this is already happening. We are taking action, things are getting better. Stories that connect action for nature with those tangible improvements in people's lives, saying this happened and now my bills are lower, or this happened and now I've got a better walk to school. And stories which normalise acting to the benefit of the environment, that it's a collective endeavour and that collective is big and broad. So telling people actually, being thinking about climate and the environment or nature is not a niche view, because everybody does think about it and everybody appreciates it. And that's really important to get over that kind of pluralistic ignorance where people might think that, oh, I'm not an environmentalist, even though I love nature, I'm not an environmentalist, I don't care about it. Everybody does, you're part of the majority. So as an example of how changing phrasing or words can actually impact how you might reach a different audience, we asked, to what extent would you support a campaign group calling for tackling climate change? And basically, you're looking at the blue numbers here, and down the left, you've got the different segments, and you can see those progressive activists. Loads of people are in favour of that, unsurprising, right? And you can see it as it goes down to the traditional conservatives at the bottom. If you change those words to what extent would you support a campaign group calling for protecting our environment, you see that broadly, progressive activists, incrementalists, left established liberals, not gone up that much, but those bottom three that were low before are now starting to move up. So just by changing tackling climate change to protecting our environment and using those, you're starting to bring people more into the conversation who maybe normally wouldn't have before. And a second example is a bit more, it's not as complex storytelling as kind of Claire was talking about, but even in just the way that we describe things in our copy, in our leaflets, in the way that we're speaking, adding more precision and using language a bit better can increase support. So if we're talking about net zero, for example, who supports this? Would you support the council setting a target to reach net zero emissions by 2045? So 50% of people said they would support that. If we add a basic explanation, council setting a target to reach net zero emissions by 2045 by providing a cleaner and more reliable energy supply, improving transport, creating new jobs, it goes up to 64%. Like actually explaining what we're doing. Seems obvious, but you're surprised how much people just say, here's the target, and expect everyone to go, oh, brilliant, great, we're going to meet this net zero target. Actually showing these outcomes that are expected, it goes up. And then how can we make it go further? We create this vision of better local climate policy that benefits people's health and happiness, makes the area safer to live in, protects local nature, working towards a sustainable future for children and next generations. So that's like a greatest hits of how the world should be. We've put loads of stuff in there. We're just trying to egg this up to show that difference is. But you can see the positivity has increased. Didn't even mention net zero there. It's just the policy that has these effects on your lives, and explaining it in that way increases the support. So that's the end of my slides there and my time. And yeah, I look forward to some questions at the end. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. And finally, Ali.
Hello. Thank you very much. Let me share my slides and we are off, hopefully. Okay. Hi, I'm Ali. I'm strategy lead with an organisation called Purpose Disruptors. I will tell you briefly a little bit about them before I tell you about Agency for Nature, which is the initiative I'll share a bit about today. So Purpose Disruptors are a not-for-profit. We're a group of people with roots in the advertising and marketing industry. So I personally have a background in that industry, but really holding a curiosity about how we can redirect the kind of like the dark arts a little bit of that industry, sort of in service of a society that is in harmony with nature. There are loads of ways that we do that span kind of regulation and policy and capacity building. My work is squarely in the culture change space, and the flagship initiative of that is called the Agency for Nature, and that's what I'm going to share a little bit about with you today. So Agency for Nature is a creative agency, a pop-up creative agency, and our objective is really to help a new generation feel emotional resonance with nature. As Chris said, we're a nation of nature lovers. We're also in a nation that is deeply disconnected, one of the most nature disconnected nations in the world. So there's that interesting paradox there, and we're really curious with this agency how we can start to redirect the creative fire powers of the advertising and broader kind of culture shaping industries to reignite that love, to feel that kind of emotional resonance. Focus being particularly on a new generation, on that kind of 18 to 30 group, because there's a nature connection dip there. So that tends to be a moment where people feel more disconnected. They're more kind of urban environments, and they tend to feel that nature is something that's over there, not where I am, not here. And that's a real problem. It's a framing problem. So I'll just briefly explain how it works. We work with top UK creative agencies, and we second creatives into our kind of fictional agency structure. They come on an immersive briefing. They spend 12 weeks learning how to develop campaigns where the client is nature. We work with a big roster of wonderful media partners, industry partners, and nature partners who help to bring the work to life, to get it out on billboards and in social media and on TV. So that's all donated media and lots of goodwill from wonderful creative collaborators and producers to make those campaigns happen. And the work tends to look a little bit different to kind of classic nature campaigns. That's really by design. You know, we are trying to create work that gives nature fresh energy in youth culture and that feels really relevant to young people's lives. And in particular, work that can travel. So work that feels kind of media first, that can move across, influencer networks that grassroots communities can pick up, that operates like kind of, a Nike campaign might do, and has that kind of emotional resonance. So I'll just share like very lightly, and you can see a bit more of the work on our website. But we've done 2 seasons now. Season 1 launched in 2024, and this is a sort of snapshot of the work. We did campaigns that touched on passion points in youth culture, so things like sex, gaming, psychedelia, coffee culture, grind culture. Season 2, we looked at drag, goth, football, tech, and street fashion. So all of these campaigns are really working out how do we fuse nature with youth culture to help people feel like, oh yeah, this is for me, this is absolutely part of my world, this is something I aspire to. And I thought if I've got time, I've got a couple of minutes, I'd share with you what the 2 seasons we've done so far have taught us about bringing nature to youth culture. It's really important to us as a very small team, that what we're doing is movement generous and is useful to the field. So we want to support culture shapers and climate and nature communicators to be more culturally fluent and to have that energy in their comms as well. So this is a really key sort of objective of what this work is about. And the first point really for us is that nature is everywhere. It's a really obvious point in some ways, but what we keep hearing from our youth councils is people say nature is over there. It's not for me, it's for countryside people, it's something else. And actually, obviously, the reality is nature is everywhere. It's happening, on the sidelines of our football pitches. It's our weather. It's even happening in kind of digital gaming environments. We are all entangled with nature wherever we are. So that's a really kind of strong thread in our work. The second point is it's not all sweetness and light, and actually that's a good thing. I think there's a really dominant narrative around nature being a place of relaxation and well-being, and maybe if you're 18 to 30, that's kind of boring. In reality, nature is, of course, all kinds of things, and it's also turbulent and formidable. And some of the campaigns we've run, including this drag campaign, really speak to those more challenging emotions and actually have had a real disproportionate kind of impact with young people. Charismatic species help build affinity. So again, just dissolving that kind of notion that nature is one big thing. You either like nature or you don't. In reality, of course, it's a myriad of different living systems and species, some of which we might just have our own attachments to and our own kind of affinities to. And that's a really important entry point for those who consider themselves disconnected. We start by paying attention to daffodils, cherry blossom, bumblebees, those kind of charismatic species that can be our gateway. Four is that nature is a setting for human connection. So we often sort of describe nature as something you go to. It's separate from my culture, my social life, which might happen in a more urban setting. But a lot of our work is really about showing nature as the setting, the natural setting for togetherness, for bonding, for intimacy, and other kinds of shared experiences. So it feels like the natural backdrop to human connection. It becomes a kind of default for that kind of social activity. And the final point is that we don't need persuading, we just need reminding. And this is probably the clearest takeout from us over 2 seasons. You know, we have had such an extraordinary response from groups we would sort of describe as like disconnected urban young people saying, yes, like this is absolutely what I want, this is for me. And it's reminded us that we are awakening an innate yearning, you know, to be alive and connected in nature. This is not something we need to persuade people of. It's not like trying to convince them that some shoes are cool. It's really in absolutely our DNA to be in tune with this. So yeah, a reminder of that. I think we can forget that in the climate movement. And finally, just a little mantra that we live by, which is if you want to change the world, you have to throw a better party. And that's really what we hope this project can be to the wider field. So, yeah, thanks, Dan. That's me.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. If you want to ask any questions, just raise your virtual hand, which I know that people sometimes struggle to find it on Zoom. If you click the big React button at the bottom of your screen, and there's an option to raise your hand. I will let people just have a wee moment to think if there's anything that they want to bring up. Kier, you can go first.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
It was a question for Chris on that last slide when you showed the different percentages of people in support regarding the way in which you describe or approach sort of the net zero targets. It was just that little bit at the bottom how you mentioned you asked the first two questions together, but the last one separately. I was just wondering what the reasoning behind that was.
Yeah, so those three parts, the two top ones they weren't asked together. So different people, there was a split question. So different people, a large sample would ask the first one, the second one together, which was using the exact wording. And then the other one was a slightly different question because it was completely different wording. So it was just the first one was in the single question structure, but a split sample. So people either got to see the technical term that stopped at reaching net zero emissions by 2045, or they got to see reach net zero emissions by 2045, providing the cleaner and more reliable energy supply, etc. And then a separate group within the survey got to see that vision of better alongside some other visions as well of the way that we describe the world. So it's just worth putting those together to show that it's the way that two are very similar in that you're just building out the sentence, and the other one is twisted and done slightly differently to create that vision better.
Okay, thank you.
Lil?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, this is a question for Ali, but also if anyone else wants to jump in, that would be very helpful too. I found your point really interesting about finding that identifying and making a big thing of charismatic species can help build affinity. I work for the Bat Conservation Trust, and an issue I often come across with is that although I and my colleagues find them very charismatic, and if you see pictures of them up close, they look adorable, but members of the public don't often see them as charismatic. So I was wondering if you could think of any ways that we can help bring those other less nice looking or less charismatic or less aesthetic species or parts of nature forward as well. And as someone in your target demographic, if I can be of any help, please do give me a shout.
I love that question. Thanks, Lil. I would say briefly, I mean, having had a bit of a background in sort of how things develop social traction, bats are one of those funny things as well that weirdly occupy a particular corner of the social media internet. And have their own kind of charisma, even if it's not an obvious one. We are actually thinking about how to develop a particular workshop for trusts who conserve particular species, because I think we do have learnings that hopefully could be valuable. And it's just that thing of like finding either is there a hook around timeliness or cultural relevance or specificity and location. But it's probably a longer answer than I can kind of ad lib now. But yeah, I don't know if Chris or Claire would have anything to add to that.
Yeah, just briefly, one of our team did an amazing, well, we thought it was a really amazing piece of work around. It wasn't bats, but it was owls. But the way she told the story was very kind of, it was that element of curiosity, wasn't it? It was that element of weirdness and quirkiness that she brought forward, which bats clearly have. So it was kind of leaning into, oh, they're not cute, but isn't this cool? And that worked really well. Yeah, sounds like a really great challenge to have.
Tamara.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, such a fascinating conversation. I just did want to say something about bats, which wasn't my question, but on Instagram, I think last year there was quite, well, maybe it's more niche than I think it is, but there was a series of portraits of bats, really close up bat faces that came across Instagram. And it certainly, I found it and shared it with my team because it was like a really professional, high quality close up photo of bats, and it was a series of all different kinds of species. And they said, I work for an environmental charity, and it went viral amongst us and our contacts because people, because we've been invited to get, it's an ugly animal and it flits about in the dark, but here it is beautifully lit close up. And my other thought on that was actually the RSPB currently are doing a campaign spotlighting birds that no one really gives a hoot about. And, like maybe they're a bit ugly or a bit boring, and they're taking a bit of a humorous angle on promoting these birds on their socials. So maybe that's another angle on bats. Anyway, slight tangent there. But yeah, my question was for Chris. So I came into environmental comms probably about 5 years ago, and I kind of inherited a lot of phrasing and buzzwords and things. And one of the conceptual approaches perhaps is that there's a climate crisis and a nature crisis, and they're twin crises, and we approach them separately. And I know I've certainly been in, groups, meetings with strategic partners that have known a lot about the climate crisis, but then you ask about biodiversity crisis, they don't know, they're not writing anything about it. I wondered if the movement now is to integrate those and not speak about them separately, and what the advantages are for both. And just one other, sorry, I know I've been talking a long time, but just one other thing. It was really, really interesting as an organisation that can't, we don't have money or capacity to do evaluation and gather data. Your explanation of the how to phrase the net zero objectives is really interesting, because again, we're constantly being told to keep everything as short as you possibly can, and people don't read more than 12 words. And so we are always trying to trim everything down, rather than saying net zero can achieve X, Y, Z. We're literally trimming down to say net zero target is 2045. Let's do it, keeping it as short as possible. So yeah, we sometimes feel like we're being pulled in one way or the other. People don't know what it means, but people don't look at our socials and read a whole ton of stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, so on that second point, I totally feel you. That's the thing, right? We all want it's great to have a shortcut where you just have a phrase and everybody just immediately agrees. But and I maybe at the start of when net zero started coming in, everyone was thinking that's something we could use and that's something we do. But the danger of having a short phrase that everyone buys into is if that short phrase is hijacked or enough to turn that phrase itself into something negative, then you're like, oh, suddenly I'm using it. I'm not everyone's not agreeing that it's a positive thing. A lot of people are saying it's actually a horrible thing that they're against, and you can't even get over that word and start to talk about the important things. So yeah, I totally feel you. It's that trade-off between being succinct in order to sort of reach people quickly, and actually being able to tell them what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think we have to move a bit more from where we are often into the explaining why we're actually doing these things, and trying to fight back for a few more words in that short sentence. On your other point about the climate and nature thing together, that's definitely what the advice is, and what our data says is that putting them together and showing them that nature affects climate, and that climate affects nature, and the actions you take for one benefits the other in many cases. That is the best way to communicate it, because nature is a lot more popular than saying climate anyway. It's usually in the other kind of direction. Like most folks on this call, I'm guessing, are more nature than climate. If we're going to separate them, then we shouldn't. But a lot of like very, very hard focused climate organisations won't ever mention nature, and in order to, the advice to them is quite simple. You need to speak about nature more. When there's nature organisations, sometimes it's harder because climate can be less popular. So if we're saying talk about climate when you're used to talking about nature, it can be seen as, oh, actually that's going to turn people off a bit more, so we'll just stick with nature. But everybody, people understand. The vast majority of people are concerned about climate change. The highest across all those different segments, bar one, I think, the highest concern when we say what are the three greatest impacts that you're most concerned about from climate change over the next 10 years, nature and wildlife comes top for all of them, apart from one segment, I think, where it comes second in terms of a ranking. So, and it's 40% of people put that in their top three, and the next highest is like 25%. So it's a far and away winner of what people see as going to be the most negative impacts from climate change. Now, there's interesting arguments about that. You could say that, as Claire and Ali talked about, being a bit disconnected from nature, maybe you only think climate change is going to affect nature, it's not going to affect me. So therefore, when someone asks me what's the impact going to be, you say, oh, it's going to be nature. But all the other data about that Ali talked about, actually the inherent connection people have to nature, and a lot of other data we've got about how people see others, and the respect they have for others when they volunteer for nature and things like that, show us that it isn't just because they think that climate change isn't going to affect them. It is because people care about nature, they know it's important, and they do already interlink it with climate anyway. So using them both together is a really strong way to kind of advance both things at the same time that we really need to, that we know we need to do. And it also, final thing, because I've gone on a bit here, final thing would be, quite often we might see climate action. We should never let the climate action go head to head with kind of nature action. So even kind of allowing that debate to happen more is really, really tough to row back from. We've all seen examples of that in the media, trying to take action on climate and it negatively affecting nature. So really trying to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to find ways to advance both at the same time. And we know there's so many ways of being able to do that.
That's great. I don't think there's any other hands up, so I'll just give people a few seconds. If you do have any burning questions you just want to get out, this is your chance. But it doesn't look like there is. So thanks very much to Chris, to Ali, and to Claire. I think that was a really, really useful session. Thanks very much for your time. And I hope everybody has a good afternoon. I'll stop recording now.